The crystal stemware shattered first. 31 pieces of imported Venetian glass hitting the Italian marble floor of Virginia's governor's mansion, and a cascading symphony of destruction that would have been beautiful if it weren't the prelude to something far worse. The sound echoed through the state dining room on that cold November evening in 1867, bouncing off walls decorated with oil paintings of men who had built their fortunes on the backs of human suffering. But the breaking glass was merely an overture. What followed in the next 40 minutes would transform Richmond's most celebrated political gathering into a charnel house that newspapers from Boston to San Francisco would describe as divine retribution for sins that legislation could never quite wash away. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Governor Harrison Caldwell clutched at his chest with hands that had signed papers keeping thousands in bondage under prettier names. His face had gone the color of old ash, lips turning blue as his heart forgot its rhythm and began the irregular stutter that precedes complete failure. Across the long mahogany table that had hosted celebrations of Confederate victories just years before, Senator James Hartwick from Massachusetts convulsed in his chair, the northern official who had come south to oversee Reconstruction now learning that some wounds refused to heal on any political timeline. Mrs. Helena Caldwell, who had spent the evening discussing the latest Paris fashions with wives of former plantation owners, slumped forward into her untouched dessert, her diamond necklace catching the candlelight one final time before her breathing stopped entirely. The Unity Banquet, as the governor's office had grandly titled the evening's affair, was meant to demonstrate Virginia's peaceful return to the Union fold. Federal officials and former Confederate leaders breaking bread together in a show of reconciliation that looked magnificent in newspaper sketches but crumbled under the weight of its own hypocrisy. The guest list read like a directory of men who had profited from slavery before the war and were finding equally profitable ways to exploit freed people after it. They had gathered in their finest evening wear, medals pinned to chests, jewels glittering at throats, confident in their safety within walls guarded by men with rifles and reinforced by laws written in their favor. None of them had thought to fear the food. By 9:45 that evening, 28 bodies would be counted among the dead. 3 more would survive long enough to describe the sensation of their hearts attempting to beat through their ribcages before surrendering to the alkaloids coursing through their bloodstreams. Dr. Augustus Mills, the mansion's physician who had been dining with the guests, would use his final moments of consciousness to scrawl 2 words in his leather notebook with a hand that shook so violently the letters were barely legible. Monkshood poisoning. The heat in the governor's mansion kitchen on the morning of November 12th could strip paint from walls. 3 massive cast iron stoves burned coal that servants hauled up from the basement in buckets that left their hands black and their lungs coated with dust that would shorten their lives by decades. The air hung thick with the competing scents of roasting meat, rising bread dough, and the sharp metallic tang of blood from the butchering that had begun before dawn. Thomas Whitmore moved through this controlled chaos with the efficiency of someone who had spent 15 years learning that survival meant making yourself indispensable. At 28, Thomas carried himself with a careful dignity that some mistook for pride and others recognized as the armor necessary for navigating a world that had granted him freedom on paper while denying it in practice. His hands bore the scars of kitchen work, burns from hot pans and cuts from knives that had slipped during the exhausted final hours of previous state dinners. Those same hands could bone a duck in under 3 minutes, create sauces that made politicians weep with pleasure, and had recently learned to crush wolfsbane flowers into powder fine enough to disappear into any dish without leaving trace of color or texture. The kitchen itself occupied the mansion's entire eastern wing, a kingdom of copper pots and ceramic crocks where Thomas ruled with quiet authority over 6 other workers who had signed contracts promising fair wages and decent treatment in exchange for their labor. The reality, as they had all discovered, was that the contracts bound them as effectively as chains ever had. Leave without permission and you violated the agreement, which meant arrest and conveyance to the county work farm where conditions made antebellum plantations look merciful by comparison. Complain about wages that never quite materialized on schedule and find yourself accused of theft or insubordination, charges that carried sentences of years at hard labor. The system had been designed by men like Victor Ashford, the governor's chief of staff, who had studied the 13th Amendment's loophole with the attention other men devoted to Scripture. Slavery was abolished except as punishment for crime, the amendment read, and Ashford had built an empire on that exception. Create enough laws that freed people would inevitably break, prosecute them with enthusiasm, and suddenly you had a labor force just as captive as before but with the added benefit of federal approval. Thomas had watched this machinery grind through the lives of people he loved for 2 years now. Had seen strong men broken by impossible quotas and women disappeared into domestic service contracts that resembled marriage in name only. Had attended funerals for children who had died from accidents that would never have happened if their parents had been allowed to refuse dangerous work. But what had finally transformed his careful planning from thought into action was the document that had arrived 3 weeks earlier, bearing the governor's official seal and informing Thomas that his 16-year-old sister Eliza had been assigned to a tobacco plantation in Southside Virginia under a 5-year apprenticeship contract. Eliza had been born in 1851, which meant she had known slavery for 14 years before Lincoln's proclamation reached Virginia. She had survived the chaos of war and the uncertain years that followed, had taught herself to read using newspapers salvaged from trash bins, and had dared to imagine a future where she might choose her own path. The apprenticeship contract crushed that dream as thoroughly as any overseer's whip. 5 years of unpaid labor disguised as training in agricultural work, assigned to a plantation. Owned by Colonel Wade Brennan, a man whose treatment of workers had earned him a reputation brutal even by the standards of those attempting to resurrect the old order under new names. Thomas had gone to the governor's office to plead for reconsideration. Had stood in the marble-floored waiting room for 6 hours before being told that Governor Caldwell was too occupied with important matters to see a contract worker about routine administrative business. Had written letters that went unanswered and sought help from northern officials who expressed sympathy but explained that they lacked authority to interfere in state labor practices. Had explored every legal avenue available to someone in his position and found them all closed by men who had rewritten the rules to ensure that freedom remained theoretical rather than actual. That was when Thomas had begun paying attention to the mansion's gardens in a new way. Grace Pemberton had worked with plants for 50 years, first as a slave forced to use her knowledge of herbs to keep other enslaved people healthy enough to work, then as a freed woman who discovered that her skills were still valuable to white employers who preferred her remedies to expensive doctors. She tended the governor's mansion grounds with the same care she had once used to maintain the medicinal gardens at the plantation where she had spent most of her life. Every morning she could be found among the flower beds that bordered the mansion's eastern wall, her weathered hands gentle with stems and roots as she coaxed blooms from soil that had drunk more suffering than rain. Thomas had known Grace since childhood. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She had delivered him, in fact, in a cabin with a dirt floor and gaps in the walls wide enough to let in snow during winter. Had cared for his mother during the fever that took her when Thomas was 9. Had been the steady presence throughout his youth who taught him that knowledge was power and that observation was the first step toward understanding how to survive in a world designed to destroy you. She had never directly told him which plants could kill, but she had taught him to recognize them, to understand their properties, to respect the fact that nature made no distinction between medicine and poison beyond questions of dosage and intent. The monk's hood grew in a shaded corner near the garden house, tall stalks crowned with purple flowers shaped like the hoods monks wore in medieval illustrations. Beautiful to look at and deadly to consume, every part of the plant contained aconitine, an alkaloid that disrupted the heart's electrical system with ruthless efficiency. Grace had pointed it out years ago during one of their walks through the grounds, mentioning casually that the governor's wife had requested it be planted because she had seen similar flowers in an English garden magazine and thought they looked distinguished. The irony was not lost on either of them that wealthy white women decorated their properties with the same plants they would have beaten enslaved gardeners for allowing near food supplies. Thomas had returned to that corner of the garden repeatedly over the past 3 weeks, always with a legitimate reason for being there. Carrying kitchen scraps for the compost heap. Delivering messages to Grace about plants needed for table arrangements. Helping repair a section of fence damage during a recent storm. Each visit allowed him to observe the monk's hood, to note which flowers were beginning to fade and drop their petals, to understand the patterns of who walked through this section of the grounds and when. The actual harvesting had taken less than 5 minutes on a foggy morning when visibility was poor and most of the mansion's occupants were still asleep. Thomas had filled his pockets with purple blooms, working quickly and leaving the plants intact enough that casual observation would reveal nothing amiss. Back in his small room in the servants' quarters, he had spread the flowers on a cloth and left them to dry in a space beneath the floorboards where no one would think to look. 3 days of careful drying followed by hours of grinding with a mortar and pestle borrowed from the kitchen stores, returned before anyone noticed its absence. The resulting powder was unremarkable in appearance, gray-brown and fine-textured, easily mistaken for any of the dozen spices that flavored the elaborate dishes expected at state dinners. Thomas had stored it in a small tin that once held black pepper, marked it with scratches that only he would recognize, and waited for the opportunity he knew would come. Governor Caldwell loved his state dinners, loved the theater of gathering important men around his table and reminding them of his power through displays of culinary excess. The Unity Banquet had been planned for months, the guest list refined and expanded as the governor's office worked to create an evening that would cement his political influence and demonstrate Virginia's successful return to prosperity. Thomas had been given the menu 3 weeks in advance. 7 courses culminating in a beef consommé that the governor had specifically requested, a clear soup that showcased the skill required to produce liquid crystal pure and intensely flavored. The consommé would be served in individual bowls, each one ladled from a large tureen that Thomas himself would prepare in the final hour before service. Perfect clarity required careful straining through layers of cheesecloth, a process that took place in the kitchen away from observing eyes. A process during which introducing additional ingredients would be simple and virtually undetectable. The days leading up to the Unity Banquet transformed the governor's mansion into a stage where every performer understood their role except the audience who would pay the final price of admission. Deliverymen arrived at dawn with crates of provisions, Pennsylvania beef and Chesapeake oysters, flour milled in Baltimore and wine shipped from France through northern ports that had grown wealthy from wartime profiteering. The same federal blockade that had starved the Confederacy now ensured that Virginia's new leadership could feast on imported luxuries while the people who had actually worked the land went hungry in neighborhoods where Reconstruction meant little more than new names for old miseries. Thomas watched these deliveries with the practiced eye of someone cataloging weaknesses in an enemy's defenses. Each crate represented a decision point, a moment when substitution or alteration might go unnoticed in the chaos of preparation. The kitchen received so many ingredients during the week before a major dinner that complete inventory was impossible. Staff worked in shifts around the clock, some sleeping on pallets in the servants' hall while others took over their stations. In this controlled pandemonium, a careful man could make certain adjustments without drawing attention, particularly if that man was trusted to oversee every aspect of menu execution. Governor Caldwell had specific expectations about his state dinners that bordered on obsession. The man who had commanded troops through some of the war's bloodiest campaigns now directed the same intensity toward questions of sauce consistency and plate presentation. He conducted tastings 3 days before each event, summoning Thomas to his private study where samples of each planned course would be evaluated with the gravity some men reserved for military strategy. The governor would taste, consider, pronounce judgment, and occasionally demand modifications that required starting entire preparations from scratch. The tasting for the Unity Banquet took place on November 9th in the late afternoon when winter sun slanted through tall windows and cast long shadows across imported rugs. Thomas had arrived carrying a wooden tray bearing small portions of each planned course, from the oyster appetizer through to the final consommé. He had stood at attention while the governor worked his way through the offerings, making notes in a leather-bound journal that contained observations about every meal served in the mansion since his inauguration. The consommé had earned particular praise. Governor Caldwell had held the cup to the light, admiring the clarity that allowed him to read newspaper text through the liquid. He had inhaled the aroma, noting the depth that came from roasting beef bones until they darkened to the color of old mahogany. He had tasted, considered, and finally nodded approval while making a note that this dish should be featured prominently in the evening service, perhaps announced with particular ceremony to ensure guests appreciated the skill required for its creation. Thomas had accepted the compliment with appropriate humility, head slightly bowed, expression neutral except for the smallest suggestion of pride at having his work recognized. Inside, he had felt nothing but cold calculation. The governor's enthusiasm for the consommé confirmed what Thomas had already suspected. This would be the ideal vehicle for his purposes. A dish served to every guest simultaneously, prepared in a single large batch rather than individual portions, strained through cloth at the final moment when the kitchen would be at its most frantic and least observant. The technical challenges were significant but not insurmountable. Aconitine dissolved poorly in water, which meant simply stirring the powder into finished consommé would leave visible particles that might alert careful diners to something amiss. Thomas needed a carrier, something that would bind with the alkaloids and distribute them evenly throughout the liquid without affecting clarity or flavor. After days of careful research in medical texts he had borrowed from a freedman's school library, he had identified beef marrow as the solution. Marrow fat melted at temperatures well below the simmering point of consommé, creating an emulsion that would carry the aconitine molecules throughout the liquid while remaining invisible once dissolved. The process required heating the marrow separately, introducing the powdered monkshood during the liquid phase, then incorporating this mixture into the consommé during the final straining process. The timing demanded precision, but Thomas had spent weeks rehearsing the sequence in his mind until he could execute it in the dark if necessary. The afternoon of November 12 arrived with temperatures cold enough to frost the mansion windows and turn breath visible in rooms distant from the stoves. Thomas had slept poorly the night before, his mind cycling through every step of the plan and identifying potential failures. What if someone decided to taste the consommé before service? What if the marrow emulsion affected clarity in ways his experiments had failed to predict? What if Grace happened to enter the kitchen during the crucial moment and recognized what he was doing? But when dawn came and he rose from his narrow bed in the servants' quarters, Thomas felt a strange calm settle over him like snow blanketing rough ground. The decision had been made weeks ago. Everything since had been implementation of a plan that would either succeed completely or fail catastrophically with no middle ground available. He dressed in his kitchen whites, tied the apron that marked him as head chef, and descended to the preparation rooms where his staff was already beginning the day's work. The kitchen operated on military precision during major events, each worker assigned specific tasks that interlocked like gears in the machinery that would produce 7 courses for 31 guests. Marie Kendrick handled the oysters, shucking them with practiced efficiency and arranging them on beds of crushed ice. Daniel Foster managed the roasting meats, calculating temperatures, and timing with the attention to detail that separated competent cooking from the excellence the governor demanded. Young Samuel Washington, barely 18 and still learning the trade, worked on vegetable preparation under Thomas's direct supervision, his knife skills improving but not yet trustworthy for critical work. Thomas moved between stations offering guidance and correction, tasting sauces and adjusting seasonings, maintaining the calm authority that kept the kitchen functioning during periods of intense stress. To any observer he appeared focused but not unusually tense, his manner consistent with past state dinners when hundreds of details demanded attention simultaneously. No one watching would have suspected that he was counting down hours until a moment that would transform Virginia's political landscape and guarantee his own death by judicial process. The morning progressed through its established rhythms. Deliveries arrived and were checked against orders. Vegetables were cleaned and cut into precise dimensions. Stock simmered in massive pots, releasing steam that made the kitchen feel like a tropical greenhouse despite the winter cold outside. Thomas had started the beef bones for the consommé at 4 a.m, wanting maximum extraction time to develop the depth of flavor the governor expected. By noon the stock had reduced by half, its surface shimmering with fat that would need to be carefully removed during clarification. Grace Pemberton appeared at the kitchen entrance around 2 in the afternoon, carrying bunches of fresh herbs from the greenhouse where she coaxed growth from plants even during winter months. She had aged visibly in recent years, her hair now entirely white and her movements slower than Thomas remembered from childhood. But her eyes remained sharp, missing nothing that happened within her field of vision. She caught Thomas's gaze as she handed over the herbs, held it for a moment that stretched longer than necessary, then turned away without speaking. That moment of eye contact communicated more than any conversation could have achieved. Grace knew. Perhaps not the specific details of what Thomas planned, but enough to understand that something significant was about to happen and that it involved knowledge she had shared without meaning to create a weapon. Her silence on the matter was its own form of complicity, a recognition that some injustices could not be addressed through official channels and that desperate times sometimes produced desperate measures that refused easy moral categorization. The clarification process for consommé was both art and science, requiring patience and technical precision in equal measure. The cloudy stock needed to be filtered through layers of cheesecloth while a mixture of egg whites and ground meat drew impurities to the surface in a process called a raft. Thomas had performed this operation hundreds of times, could execute it while simultaneously managing 3 other dishes, but today he worked alone at the clarification station with instructions that he not be disturbed during this critical phase. He had crushed the dried monkshood into powder so fine it felt like silk between his fingers, storing the lethal preparation in a small container that looked identical to dozens of other spice tins scattered throughout the kitchen. The beef marrow had been set aside earlier, for ounces of pale fat removed from roasted bones and kept warm in a small pot on the edge of the stove. Everything was positioned for what would take less than 3 minutes to complete. The timing was crucial. Too early and someone might notice the marrow addition and question it. Too late and the consommé would already be in the serving terrain beyond his ability to modify. Thomas waited until the clarification was nearly complete, the liquid transforming from cloudy amber to the crystal transparency the governor had admired during tasting. The kitchen around him had reached peak chaos, 6 different courses at various stages of completion and the staff fully occupied with their assigned responsibilities. Thomas removed the marrow from the warming pot and stirred in the monkshood powder, watching it dissolve into the melted fat like storm clouds diffusing into clear sky. The mixture turned slightly darker but remained translucent, showing no visible particles that might alert anyone to its true nature. He added this to the consommé during the final straining process, incorporating it thoroughly while the liquid passed through its last layer of cheesecloth. The alkaloids distributed themselves evenly throughout the volume, invisible and undetectable by any sense except perhaps the faint bitterness that would be masked by the rich beef flavor. The finished consommé glowed golden in its copper pot, perfect in clarity and aroma. Thomas ladled a small amount into a cup and held it to the light exactly as the governor had done during tasting. The liquid remained absolutely clear, no cloudiness or particles to suggest anything beyond masterful technique. He brought the cup to his nose and inhaled, detecting nothing but the deep beef essence that represented hours of careful work. For a moment he stood motionless, holding a cup that contained death rendered invisible, considering the weight of what he had just created. 28 people would die tonight. Not all of them deserved it by any reasonable measure of justice. Some of the dinner guests were minor functionaries whose primary crime was accepting an invitation to a government event. Others were wives whose guilt consisted mainly of marriage to powerful men. A few were even northern officials who had come south with genuine intentions of ensuring fair treatment for freed people and been corrupted by the comfortable reality that changing a system was harder than profiting from it. But among those 28 would be Governor Caldwell, who had signed the paper sending Eliza to 5 years of unpaid labor. Victor Ashford, who had designed the contract system that reduced freedom to a legal fiction. Colonel Brennan, whose plantation had consumed the lives of dozens of workers who had believed they were finally free. Judge Marcus Sutherland, who had ruled consistently that contract violations justified years of imprisonment. Senator Hartwick, who had blocked every attempt to strengthen federal oversight of Southern labor practices. These men had built a new version of slavery that looked legal on paper while functioning identically to the old system in practice. They had used law itself as a weapon against people who lacked the resources to fight in courts designed to ensure they would lose. They had wrapped exploitation in the language of contracts and commerce, creating the appearance of voluntary employment while maintaining the reality of forced labor through mechanisms just as effective as physical chains. Thomas had spent months trying to find another way. Had written letters and filed complaints and spoken to anyone who might have influence over his sister's fate. Had explored every avenue that the legal system theoretically provided for people in his position. Every door had closed, every appeal had been denied, every official had explained with varying degrees of sympathy that nothing could be done within the boundaries of law as currently written. So Thomas had gone outside those boundaries into territory where morality became complicated and justice required accepting consequences that would destroy him as thoroughly as it destroyed his targets. He had chosen to become a killer because the alternative was accepting that Eliza would be worked to death on a tobacco plantation while he continued cooking meals for the men responsible. Some choices were impossible, their weight too heavy to lift, but refusing to make them was also a choice with its own terrible price. He poured the consomme into the ornate silver tureen that would be carried to the dining room for service, noting with professional satisfaction how the liquid caught light and reflected it with jewel-like brilliance. The governor would be pleased with the presentation, would probably make a speech about the skill of Virginia's finest chef and the quality that defined the new South they were building together. Thomas would stand in the doorway to receive this praise, would nod with appropriate modesty, and would watch every person in that room consume the poison he had prepared with the same care he brought to every other dish. The first course was scheduled for service at 6:30, with subsequent courses arriving at carefully timed intervals designed to allow conversation between dishes. The consommé would be served forth, after oysters, salad, and roasted duck, arriving at approximately 8 o'clock when guests would be relaxed from wine and conversation. The timing would place symptoms onset around 40 minutes after consumption, early enough that everyone who had eaten would still be present, late enough that the connection to the consommé might not be immediately obvious. Thomas had calculated dosage with brutal precision. The monkshood flowers he had harvested contained variable amounts of aconitine depending on their maturity and growing conditions, but medical literature suggested that 5 to 6 milligrams constituted a lethal dose for an adult human. He had used enough powder to ensure approximately 10 milligrams per serving, accounting for potential variations in potency and allowing margin for error. At that concentration, death would come quickly but not instantaneously, providing perhaps 30 minutes of increasing distress before cardiac arrest stopped the heart entirely. It would not be a peaceful death. The aconitine would cause numbness of the extremities followed by nausea, vomiting, and intense chest pain as the heart's electrical system failed. Victims would experience the sensation of their hearts beating irregularly, sometimes racing, sometimes stopping entirely for seconds at a time. Breathing would become difficult as the respiratory system succumbed to the same neurotoxic effects. Consciousness would persist almost until the end, meaning every person in that dining room would know they were dying and have time to contemplate the injustice of their situation. Thomas felt no satisfaction at contemplating this suffering, but neither did he feel remorse. These were the consequences of choices the victims themselves had made when they decided to build their wealth and power on the backs of people they refused to recognize as fully human. They had created a system that treated freed people as resources to be exploited rather than citizens deserving protection under law. They had written contracts designed to trap the desperate and pour into arrangements that differed from slavery only in terminology. They had benefited from others' misery and called it progress. The kitchen staff completed their preparations with the synchronized efficiency that came from weeks of practice. Each course was plated with attention to visual presentation that matched its flavor complexity. Marie had arranged the oysters like abstract art, each one nestled in ice and garnished with shaved horseradish that added visual brightness. Daniel's duck emerged from the oven with skin crackling and golden, the meat beneath tender enough to cut with a fork. The salad featured winter greens from the mansion greenhouse, dressed with vinegar that balanced the richness of surrounding courses. Thomas supervised the final preparations while mentally rehearsing his own role in the evening's performance. He would remain in the kitchen during most of the dinner, available to address any issues that arose but not expected to enter the dining room except for the consommé service. That presentation had been planned as a ceremonial moment, the silver tureen brought in on a wheeled cart while Thomas followed behind to receive recognition for his skill. He would ladle the lethal soup into individual bowls, starting with the governor and working down the table according to rank and social position, ensuring every guest received their portion before returning to the kitchen. Then he would wait. Would continue supervising the final courses while in the next room people began experiencing the first symptoms. Would maintain his professional composure when staff rushed into the kitchen reporting that something was wrong with the guests. Would express appropriate concern and confusion when questions were asked about ingredients and preparation methods. Would watch as the evening's careful planning dissolved into chaos and death. Grace Pemberton returned to the kitchen shortly before service began, ostensibly to collect her payment for the herbs she had supplied. She found Thomas alone for a moment at the clarification station, checking temperatures and making final adjustments to sauces. She approached quietly, her weathered hand briefly touching his shoulder in a gesture that could have meant anything or nothing. "Some plants," she said softly, "carry medicine or poison depending on how they're used. The difference isn't in the plant itself but in the hands that prepare it and the purpose behind the preparation." Thomas nodded without turning to face her, understanding that she was offering not approval but acknowledgement of the complexity of what he had chosen. Grace had spent 50 years healing people, using her knowledge of plants to ease suffering and extend lives. She understood better than anyone that the same knowledge could serve opposite purposes, that the line between remedy and weapon was often invisible until the moment of application. "I've spent my whole life," Grace continued, "trying to keep people alive in a world designed to kill them. Sometimes I succeeded, sometimes I failed, but I never stopped believing that life was worth preserving even when it came wrapped in suffering. What you're about to do challenges that belief in ways I'm still wrestling with." She fell silent for a long moment, her hand still resting on Thomas's shoulder while the kitchen noise swirled around them. When she spoke again her voice carried a weight that made clear she had reached some difficult conclusion. "But I also understand that some evils become so entrenched that healing is impossible without first cutting away the diseased tissue. Perhaps that's what you're doing tonight. Removing a poison from the body politic so that something healthier might grow in its place. Or perhaps you're just adding more poison to an already toxic system. I honestly don't know, and I suspect you don't either." Thomas finally turned to meet her eyes, seeing in them a mixture of sorrow and resignation that mirrored his own conflicted feelings. "If there was another way," he began, but Grace raised her hand to stop him. "Don't explain yourself to me. I'm not here to judge or absolve you. I'm here to tell you that whatever happens tonight, whatever consequences follow, you won't face them alone. I've lived long enough to know that sometimes the innocent suffer for what the guilty made necessary, and if that's my fate for teaching you what plants can do, then I'll accept it as the price of having given you the only weapon you could wield against people who made themselves immune to every other form of accountability." With that she turned and left the kitchen, her departure timed to avoid drawing attention from the other staff members who were now fully occupied with final preparations. Thomas stood motionless for a moment, processing the conversation and what it meant. Grace had just confessed to knowing his intentions and accepting complicity in their execution. She had also indicated that she expected to be blamed, understanding that investigators would look for someone to punish and that an elderly black woman with knowledge of poisonous plants would be a convenient target. The weight of that realization pressed down on Thomas with force enough to buckle his knees. He had planned his own death as an acceptable consequence of his actions, had accepted that justice for Eliza would cost him his life. But the possibility that Grace might pay the price instead or in addition had not fully penetrated his calculations until now. She was 70 years old, had survived slavery and war and Reconstruction only to potentially end her life on a gallows because she had taught a desperate young man which flowers could kill. For a moment Thomas considered abandoning the entire plan. He could dispose of the poison consommé, prepare a fresh batch from untainted stock, and let the Unity banquet proceed as Governor Caldwell had envisioned. Eliza would still be sent to the tobacco plantation, contract workers would continue suffering under the new slavery that called itself something else, and the men who had built this system would continue profiting from it without consequence. But Grace would live, and perhaps that was the more moral choice than sacrificing her to punish people who deserved punishment. The clock on the kitchen wall showed 6:15. In 15 minutes the first guests would be seated and the evening service would begin. Thomas had perhaps 5 minutes to make a final decision that would determine not just his own fate but Grace's and potentially alter the political trajectory of Virginia's Reconstruction. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the preparation table, steadying himself against the weight of the choice he faced. Then he thought of Eliza, 16 years old and believing she had finally escaped slavery only to be told she had been assigned to 5 years of unpaid labor under a man known for violence against workers who disappointed him. He thought of all the other Elizas across Virginia and throughout the South, people who had believed that freedom meant something only to discover it was a word on paper without corresponding reality. He thought of the men in the dining room who would soon be toasting their own success at maintaining power while the people they exploited went hungry in neighborhoods they never visited. Thomas released his grip on the table and straightened his shoulders. The consommé would be served as planned. Grace had made her own choice to accept consequences, just as he had made his. They were both casualties of a system that had forced them to choose between impossible alternatives, and if they died for trying to destroy that system, then perhaps their deaths would mean something beyond the usual waste of lives treated as disposable. The serving staff began arriving to collect the first course. Thomas watched the oysters disappear through the doorway into the dining room where guests were taking their seats. He could hear the murmur of conversation and occasional laughter, the sounds of people comfortable and secure in their positions. They had no idea that the evening they had come to celebrate would be their last, that the chef whose food they had praised was serving them death along with consommé. The state dining room of Virginia's governor's mansion had witnessed countless meals since its construction in 1813, but none had assembled a guest list quite like the Unity banquet. The room itself spoke of wealth accumulated through generations of tobacco fortunes and political influence, its walls covered in silk damask the color of dried blood, its ceiling adorned with plasterwork depicting scenes from classical mythology where gods punished mortals for their hubris. 3 crystal chandeliers hung from brass chains, each one holding 40 candles that cast dancing light across a table set with china so fine you could read newsprint through it. Governor Harrison Caldwell occupied the head of the table with the bearing of a man accustomed to command. At 52 he remained physically imposing despite the softness that prosperity had added to his frame. His beard was trimmed in the style favored by former Confederate officers, equal parts dignified and defiant. He wore his dress uniform tonight, the gray wool altered to remove Confederate insignia but still recognizable to anyone who had lived through the war. The medals on his chest represented battles at Chancellorsville and Petersburg, campaigns where he had commanded men who died believing they were defending a way of life that included the right to own other human beings. To his right sat Senator James Hartwick of Massachusetts, a man whose journey from abolitionist rhetoric to Reconstruction complicity illustrated the corrosive power of political pragmatism. Hartwick had once given speeches calling for full citizenship rights for freed people, had written pamphlets demanding immediate equality under law. But 4 years in Washington had taught him that idealism was less valuable than compromise, that Northern business interests profited from Southern labor practices regardless of what those practices were called. He had voted against 3 separate bills that would have strengthened federal oversight of contract labor systems, explaining each time that the South needed time to adjust and that forcing change too rapidly would only provoke resistance. Mrs. Helena Caldwell sat to her husband's left, her neck and wrists adorned with diamonds that had been hidden from Union troops during the war and retrieved after. She had spent the afternoon overseeing final details of the evening's presentation, ensuring the flowers were arranged properly and the silver was polished to reflective brilliance. Her concerns extended no further than questions of aesthetic propriety and social hierarchy. The people who had prepared this meal existed in her awareness only as functions rather than individuals, their names unknown and their circumstances irrelevant beyond their ability to execute tasks she deemed necessary. Colonel Wade Brennan commanded attention 3 seats down from the governor, his presence dominating the space around him through sheer physical bulk and the aggressive confidence of someone who had never been held accountable for anything. His plantation in Southside Virginia had transitioned from slavery to contract labor without missing a season's tobacco crop. Workers who had once been property now signed papers they couldn't read binding them to years of unpaid labor in exchange for room and board that barely kept them alive. Brennan considered this progress and said so frequently to anyone who would listen. He had requested Eliza Whitmore specifically after seeing her at a church social, telling his overseer he wanted someone young and trainable for the women's field crew. Judge Marcus Sutherland represented the judicial branch of Virginia's new order, a man who had spent the past 2 years ruling that contract violations justified imprisonment and that workers had no right to leave employment regardless of conditions. His legal opinions had created the framework that made the new slavery possible, citing precedents about contract sanctity while ignoring the duress under which such contracts were signed. He considered himself a moderate, someone who prevented worse outcomes through careful application of law, never acknowledging that his moderation was measured against a baseline so extreme that anything short of open violence seemed reasonable by comparison. Victor Ashford sat near the table's center, his position reflecting his role as architect of policies others merely implemented. At 38 he was younger than most men in the room but more influential than many with greater formal authority. He had studied law at Harvard before the war, had returned to Virginia afterward with plans to restore the state's prosperity through what he called rational labor management. His papers on contract systems had been published in journals throughout the South, providing theoretical justification for practices that amounted to slavery by another name. He spoke in the measured tones of someone presenting objective analysis rather than defending mechanisms designed to exploit human desperation. The remaining guests represented variations on these themes. Plantation owners who had survived the war with their land intact and were determined to restore pre-war production levels regardless of cost to workers. Merchants who supplied goods to both planters and contract workers, profiting from both sides of a system that kept one group wealthy and the other permanently indebted. State legislators who had written laws making it criminal for workers to leave employment without permission, creating the enforcement mechanisms that made contract labor function identically to slavery. Federal officials who had come south ostensibly to oversee Reconstruction but had instead been absorbed into social circles where it was easier to approve existing arrangements than challenge them. Only 3 women attended the dinner beyond Mrs. Caldwell. Mrs. Adelaide Hartwick accompanied her senator husband, a Boston native who had initially been appalled by Southern conditions but had learned to focus on the civilized aspects of life in Richmond rather than the suffering visible in neighborhoods she never visited. Mrs. Eleanor Brennan knew exactly what kind of man she had married and seemed to consider his brutality toward workers as evidence of the strength she found attractive. Miss Catherine Ashford was Victor's younger sister, unmarried at 26 and considered unlikely to find a husband due to her unfortunate tendency to express opinions about political matters. She sat quietly during most conversations but her eyes missed nothing, recording details others dismissed as irrelevant. The first course arrived at 6:45, carried by servers who had been instructed to move silently and keep their eyes downcast unless directly addressed. The oysters gleamed on their beds of ice, each one topped with a precise amount of horseradish and a single drop of lemon juice. Governor Caldwell raised his glass in a toast before anyone could begin eating, his voice carrying the practiced projection of someone accustomed to addressing troops across battlefield noise. Gentlemen and ladies, we gather tonight to celebrate Virginia's return to prosperity and the Union's restoration. The war tested us all, but we have emerged stronger and more united in purpose. The contracts we have established ensure fair treatment for all parties while maintaining the productivity essential to our state's economy. Those who claim these arrangements are unjust simply don't understand the complexity of managing labor in an agricultural economy. We have found the balance between freedom and order, between rights and responsibilities, and tonight we toast our success in navigating challenges that lesser men would have found insurmountable. The assembled guests raised their glasses and drank, some with enthusiasm and others with the mechanical compliance of people performing expected social gestures. Senator Hartwick added his own remarks about the importance of patience in Reconstruction, about allowing the South time to adjust to new circumstances without federal interference that would only breed resistance. Judge Sutherland spoke briefly about the rule of law and the sanctity of contracts freely entered. Each speaker reinforced the other's points until a narrative emerged that framed exploitation as progress and suffering as the natural consequence of economic forces beyond anyone's control. Through the walls separating the dining room from the kitchen, Thomas could hear fragments of these speeches, the self-congratulatory tone audible even when specific words were muffled by distance and intervening doors. He continued supervising the preparation of subsequent courses while tracking time with the precision of someone counting down to a moment that would transform everything. The salad course departed at 7:15, the duck at 7:40. Each dish received compliments from the dining room, praise for flavors and presentation that validated Thomas's reputation as Virginia's finest chef. Samuel Washington worked beside Thomas during these final preparations, his young face showing the concentration of someone still learning the trade's intricacies. He had been assigned to assist specifically with the consommé service, tasked with wheeling the cart that would carry the silver tureen into the dining room. Samuel knew nothing about what the consommé actually contained, saw it only as another dish requiring careful handling to maintain its temperature and clarity during transport. His innocence was absolute and would remain so until the moment symptoms began appearing among the guests. At 7:55 Thomas performed a final inspection of the consommé, confirming that its appearance remained flawless despite the poison it contained. The liquid glowed golden in the light from overhead oil lamps, its surface completely still in the moments before service. He ladled a small amount into a white porcelain cup and held it to the light exactly as he had done during the governor's tasting, verifying that clarity remained perfect and no particles floated in suspension. The aconitine had dissolved completely into the beef marrow emulsion, leaving no visual evidence of its presence. Marie Kendrick approached with a question about the final course, a chocolate mousse that required precise timing to achieve proper texture. Thomas answered automatically while his mind tracked the minutes remaining before the consommé would leave the kitchen. 5 minutes until Samuel would wheel the cart to the dining room doorway. 7 minutes until Thomas would begin ladling soup into individual bowls. 10 minutes until every person in that dining room would have consumed a lethal dose of monkshood alkaloids. The weight of what he was about to do pressed down with physical force, making breathing difficult, and causing sweat to bead on his forehead despite the kitchen's familiar heat. Thomas had lived with this decision for weeks, had examined it from every angle and convinced himself it was necessary. But now that the moment had arrived, he felt the full horror of deliberate mass murder settling onto his shoulders like a coat made of lead. 28 people would die because of actions he was about to take. Some deserved death by any reasonable measure of justice, but others were guilty mainly of failing to resist a corrupt system, and a few were innocent except for accepting an invitation to dinner. Grace Pemberton's words echoed in his memory. Perhaps you're removing poison from the body politic, or perhaps you're just adding more poison to an already toxic system. Thomas genuinely didn't know which interpretation was correct. He only knew that every alternative he had explored had failed, that his sister faced 5 years of brutality that would destroy her if it didn't kill her, and that the men responsible for these circumstances would face no consequences unless someone stepped outside the boundaries of law to deliver justice that courts refused to provide. The clock showed 8. Samuel stood ready by the cart, waiting for Thomas's signal to begin the procession to the dining room. The silver tureen sat in its position of honor, steam rising from its surface in wisps that caught light and vanished. Thomas picked up the ladle that would serve as his weapon, testing its weight and balance the way a soldier might check his rifle before battle. Everything was ready. The only question remaining was whether he would follow through or abandon the plan at this final moment when retreat was still theoretically possible. He thought of Eliza's face when he had told her about the apprenticeship assignment. She had cried for the first time since childhood, tears of frustration and rage rather than sadness. She had spent the days after learning to read, had imagined a future where she might teach other freed children or perhaps work in a store where reading would be valuable. The apprenticeship crushed those dreams as thoroughly as any overseer's whip, consigning her to 5 years in tobacco fields where reading skills were worthless and hopes died under sun that turned skin to leather and bent backs permanently forward. Thomas nodded to Samuel, who began pushing the cart toward the dining room. The wheels squeaked slightly despite fresh oil on their axles, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in Thomas's heightened awareness. He followed behind the cart, carrying the ladle and a stack of warm soup bowls, his face composed in an expression of professional pride that concealed the storm of emotion roiling beneath. The dining room conversation faded as the cart entered, guests turning to watch the ceremonial presentation of the course Governor Caldwell had praised during tasting. Thomas positioned himself beside the tureen and began the service with practiced efficiency, starting at the head of the table where the governor waited with an expression of anticipation. The first ladle of consommé poured into the bowl with a sound like liquid gold, catching light and releasing steam that carried the rich aroma of roasted beef. Governor Caldwell accepted his portion with a nod of approval, immediately lifting a spoon to taste. His face showed genuine pleasure at the flavor, exactly the response Thomas had cultivated through years of careful attention to the man's preferences. "Magnificent," the governor said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. This is why Virginia's cuisine remains unmatched despite all we've endured. Thomas here represents the finest traditions of Southern cooking, refined through adversity into something even greater than what came before. Thomas moved to the next guest, Senator Hartwick, ladling consommé with the same careful precision. Then to Mrs. Caldwell, whose diamonds caught light and threw rainbow fragments across the white tablecloth. Down the line he progressed, serving each guest in order of social rank, ensuring every bowl contained an equal portion of both soup and poison. His hands remained steady despite the trembling he felt internally, years of professional discipline overriding the natural horror at what he was doing. Colonel Brennan received his portion with a grunt that might have been approval, immediately consuming half the bowl in a few quick spoonfuls. Judge Sutherland inhaled the aroma appreciatively before tasting, making a comment about how proper beef consommé was a lost art that few modern cooks could master. Victor Ashford studied his portion with the analytical attention he brought to everything, noting how the clarity allowed him to see the bowl's decorative pattern through the liquid. The service took 11 minutes to complete, Thomas working methodically down both sides of the long table until every guest had received their portion. He returned the ladle to the tureen and stepped back, assuming the position near the doorway where he would wait to receive any compliments or concerns. From this vantage point he could observe the entire table, could watch as 28 people consumed the poison he had prepared with as much care as any other dish in his culinary career. The conversation resumed, guests discussing the consommé's excellence and using it as a springboard for broader observations about Virginia's restored prosperity. Several people finished their portions quickly and looked disappointed that the tureen had been removed, unaware that seconds would have merely hastened their deaths by a few minutes. Others sipped slowly, savoring flavors they would never taste again, their final meal prepared by someone they had never considered human enough to acknowledge beyond their functional role. Thomas stood perfectly still, his face composed in an expression of modest pride while internally he counted down minutes until symptoms would begin. The aconitine was already being absorbed through the stomach lining, entering the bloodstream and beginning its journey to the heart and nervous system. In approximately 30 minutes the first signs would appear, numbness in the extremities and tingling around the mouth. Shortly after that would come the nausea and the burning sensation in the chest as hearts began losing their rhythm. He wondered if he should feel something other than this strange calm. Remorse perhaps, or satisfaction, or even fear about the consequences he would face once the poison source was discovered. But all he felt was a kind of hollow determination, the sense of having set something in motion that could not be stopped and must be seen through to its conclusion. He had crossed a line that most people never approached, had chosen to become a killer because every alternative had been blocked by people who now sat digesting their final meal while discussing politics and cotton prices. Miss Catherine Ashford caught Thomas's eye from her position halfway down the table. For a moment their gazes locked, and in her expression he saw something unexpected. Not suspicion exactly, but a kind of knowing awareness that suggested she understood more than her brother credited. She had been watching Thomas throughout the service, had noted details others missed. Whether she would speak up about her observations remained to be seen, but for now she simply returned her attention to the conversation around her without raising alarm. The clock on the dining room mantel showed 8:20. Thomas calculated that first symptoms would appear around 8:50, giving him 30 minutes to maintain his position near the doorway while appearing calm and unsuspecting. The next course, a palate cleanser of lemon sorbet, was scheduled for 8:40 but would never be served. By that time the dining room would have transformed from celebration to catastrophe, and Thomas's role would shift from chef to primary suspect in what would become Virginia's most shocking political crime. He thought briefly about escape, about the possibility of fleeing Richmond before his guilt could be established. But escape would mean abandoning Grace to face accusations alone, would mean leaving Eliza to her fate on the tobacco plantation, would mean running from consequences he had accepted when he first ground the monkshood flowers into powder. Whatever came next, Thomas would face it here in the mansion where he had spent 15 years perfecting the craft he had just used to kill 28 people. The dinner guests continued their conversation, unaware that they were already dying, that the excellent consommé they had praised contained alkaloids that were even now disrupting the electrical signals their hearts needed to maintain regular rhythm. They spoke of the future with the confidence of people who believed they would see it, made plans for business ventures and political campaigns that would never come to fruition. Their voices filled the dining room with the sound of comfortable privilege, the certainty of people who had never seriously considered the possibility that their victims might find a way to strike back. Thomas watched them all with the detachment of someone observing a play where he knew the final act, but the performers remained ignorant of their approaching fate. In less than 30 minutes this scene of satisfied celebration would dissolve into screaming chaos and then into the silence that comes when hearts stop beating. The Unity Banquet would be remembered not as a celebration of reconstruction but as evidence that some wounds refuse to heal, that injustice eventually produces consequences even when those consequences come wrapped in tragedy that destroys both guilty and innocent alike. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.